The biotech millionaire stepped through the marble entrance of his Beverly Hills mansion and froze in absolute horror. There, in the center of his pristine living room, his 7-year-old daughter, Isabella, sat huddled on the cold floor, her once beautiful pink dress now torn and filthy, clutching her 10-month-old baby brother Lucas in her trembling arms. Her voice cracked with desperate sobs as she pleaded through tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Please don't hurt us anymore. We're so scared." At that exact moment, every carefully hidden secret within the Montgomery estate was about to unravel, revealing a web of deception that would shake the very foundation of everything. Alexander Montgomery thought he knew about his own home. Alexander Montgomery sat rigidly in his corner office on the 38th floor of Montgomery Biotech Tower in downtown Los Angeles, his steely gray eyes fixed on the sprawling city below. At 45, he commanded one of the most successful pharmaceutical empires on the West Coast, his company's groundbreaking cancer research treatments having saved countless lives and earned him a fortune worth over $2 billion. The mahogany desk before him gleamed under the crystal chandelier's light, scattered with patent applications and FDA approval documents that could change the medical world forever. His Brioni suit fit his broad shoulders perfectly, the platinum Patek Philippe watch on his wrist catching the afternoon sunlight that streamed through floor-to-ceiling windows. Everything in his meticulously organized office spoke of unprecedented success, brilliant scientific achievement, and the kind of power that most men only dreamed of possessing. But behind those piercing gray eyes lay a hollowness that no amount of wealth could ever fill. Alexander had once lived in a world filled with genuine laughter, unconditional love, and the simple joy of family dinners around a table where conversation flowed as naturally as breathing. Catherine, his beloved first wife, had been his anchor, his inspiration, his reason for pushing the boundaries of medical science. Isabella, their precious daughter, used to run through their vineyard with her golden curls bouncing in the California sunshine, her infectious giggles echoing off the Spanish-style architecture of their estate. And then came Lucas, their miracle baby, born during Catherine's final battle against the very disease Alexander had dedicated his career to conquering. The cruel irony wasn't lost on him. While his company developed cutting-edge treatments that extended lives for thousands of patients worldwide, he had been powerless to save the one person who meant everything to him. Catherine's 18-month fight against aggressive breast cancer had drained not just her physical strength, but Alexander's emotional reserves as well. Every experimental treatment, every late-night consultation with oncologists, every moment spent researching potential cures had consumed him entirely. When she finally passed away 10 months ago, just weeks after Lucas was born, Alexander felt as though his heart had been surgically removed without anesthesia. In the months following Catherine's death, he had thrown himself into his work with almost manic intensity, accepting every speaking engagement, every international conference, every business trip that would take him away from the estate that held too many memories of happier times. The empty hallways echoed with Catherine's laughter. The vineyard reminded him of afternoon walks discussing their dreams for the children's future, and the master bedroom still carried the faint scent of her favorite perfume. Running away seemed easier than facing the devastating reality that the love of his life was never coming home. During those dark months of avoidance and grief, Vivian Ashford had appeared in their lives like an answered prayer. Catherine's former sorority sister from Stanford, Vivian possessed the kind of polished elegance that commanded attention in any room. With her platinum blonde hair always styled to perfection, designer clothes that hugged her model-thin figure, and a smile that could charm board members and social committee leaders alike, she seemed like the perfect solution to Alexander's overwhelming situation. When she volunteered to help care for Isabella and Lucas while he traveled for work, her offer felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. Vivian moved into the guest wing with a grace that made the transition seem effortless. She organized playdates for Isabella, hired the most qualified nannies for Lucas, and maintained the household with an efficiency that impressed even Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, their longtime housekeeper who had worked for the Montgomery family since Catherine was alive. To Alexander's guilt-ridden mind, Vivian represented everything he felt incapable of providing: maternal warmth, domestic stability, and the kind of consistent presence his children desperately needed. The marriage proposal came 6 months after Catherine's death. Delivered over dinner at Spago, Beverly Hills, where Vivian had worn a stunning black Valentino dress that made every head in the restaurant turn. She had reached across the table, placed her manicured hand over his, and whispered words that seemed to lift the crushing weight from his shoulders. "Those children need a mother, Alexander, and you need a partner who understands the demands of your career. Let me be that for you. Let me honor Catherine's memory by giving Isabella and Lucas the stability they deserve." The wedding was a small, intimate ceremony held in the estate's rose garden, with only immediate family and a few close friends in attendance. Alexander had convinced himself that this practical arrangement was best for everyone involved. Isabella would have a mother figure, Lucas would have consistent care, and he could continue building the company that funded cancer research in Catherine's name. If the marriage lacked the passionate love he had shared with his first wife, that seemed like an acceptable sacrifice for his children's well-being. But now, 8 months into this carefully constructed new life, Alexander found himself staring at his reflection in the office window, seeing a stranger wearing his face. The man looking back at him had forgotten how to be a father, how to comfort his daughter's nightmares, how to make Lucas laugh with silly faces during feeding time. He had become so skilled at avoiding painful emotions that he had numbed himself to joy as well, turning into a ghost who haunted his own life. Today, however, something felt different. Perhaps it was the way the afternoon light fell across Catherine's photograph on his desk. Or maybe it was the sudden, overwhelming memory of Isabella's 5th birthday party, when she had insisted on wearing her mother's pearl necklace, "because it makes me feel close to Mummy." Whatever the catalyst, Alexander found himself seized by an irresistible urge to go home early, to surprise his children, to maybe begin the long journey back to being the father they deserved. He closed the quarterly reports without finishing them, something he had never done in his entire career. His secretary, Patricia, looked shocked when he appeared in her doorway at 3 o'clock, briefcase in hand and car keys already out. "Cancel everything for the rest of the day," he told her, his voice carrying a determination that had been absent for far too long. "If anyone asks, tell them I have the most important meeting of my life." The drive through Beverly Hills took him past familiar landmarks: the country club where he and Catherine had celebrated their 10th anniversary, the park where Isabella had learned to ride her bike, the medical center where Lucas had been born. Each location stirred memories that he had spent months trying to suppress. But today, they felt less like wounds and more like gentle reminders of a life worth fighting to reclaim. As his silver Bentley turned into the circular driveway of the Montgomery estate, Alexander felt his heart rate quicken with an emotion he hadn't experienced in almost a year: anticipation. The Spanish colonial mansion stood majestically against the backdrop of rolling hills, its terracotta roof tiles and pristine white walls glowing in the late afternoon sunshine. The vineyard stretched out to the east, heavy with clusters of grapes that would soon be ready for harvest, just as Catherine had always dreamed. He parked in front of the main entrance, took a deep breath to steady his nerves, and walked quickly toward the massive wooden doors that had welcomed his family home for over a decade. The brass key turned smoothly in the lock, and he stepped into the marble foyer with its soaring ceiling and wrought iron chandelier that Catherine had selected during their renovation years ago. The first thing that struck him was the unnatural silence that seemed to press against his eardrums like a physical weight. The house felt empty, devoid of the sounds of children playing or even the quiet hum of daily life. Where were Isabella's piano practice sessions? Where was Lucas's babbling from his playpen? Where was the soft classical music that Vivian always played during the afternoon hours? Alexander set his briefcase down on the antique console table and called out softly, not wanting to startle anyone if they were napping, "Isabella, Vivian, I'm home early today." His voice echoed off the marble floors and high ceilings, but no response came back to him. Then, from somewhere deeper in the house, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice in his veins. The sound of a child crying. Not the normal tears of a scraped knee or a broken toy, but the kind of heartbreaking sobs that spoke of deep, soul-crushing fear. The sound was coming from the main living room, just around the corner from where he stood frozen in the foyer. Alexander moved forward on silent feet, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the marble floor. As he approached the arched doorway that led to the living room, the crying grew louder. Joined by another sound that made his heart stop completely, his daughter's voice, small and broken, pleading with someone in desperate, terrified whispers. He pressed his back against the wall just outside the doorway and listened with growing horror. "Please don't hurt us anymore, we're so scared," Isabella was saying. Her words punctuated by sobs that seemed to tear something vital inside Alexander's chest. "Lucas is hungry. He hasn't eaten since this morning. Please, I'll be good. I promise, I'll be good." The response that came back made Alexander's hands clench into fists at his sides. Vivian's voice, but stripped of every trace of the sweetness she had always shown him, cut through the air like a blade dipped in venom. "You think I care if that brat is hungry? You think I care about either of you pathetic little reminders of your precious dead mother?" Alexander's vision blurred with rage as he heard his wife continue her verbal assault on his children. "Your father doesn't want you. Why do you think he's never home? Why do you think he runs away every chance he gets? You're nothing but burdens, both of you, and the sooner you learn that, the easier this will be for everyone." Unable to remain hidden any longer, Alexander stepped around the corner and into the living room, where the scene that greeted him would be burned into his memory forever. Isabella sat on the cold marble floor in the center of the room, still wearing the pink dress he had bought her for Easter. But now it was torn at the shoulder and stained with something he didn't want to identify. Her golden curls were tangled and matted, and tear tracks ran down her dirt-smudged cheeks. In her thin arms, she held Lucas protectively, the baby's face red from crying, his tiny hands grasping desperately at his sister's dress. Standing over them like some perfectly groomed predator was Vivian, wearing an emerald green cocktail dress that probably cost more than most people's monthly salary. Her platinum hair was styled in an elegant chignon, her makeup was flawless, and her jewelry sparkled under the chandelier lights. She looked like she was dressed for a charity luncheon, not for torturing children in her own home. When Vivian saw Alexander standing in the doorway, the transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. The cruel sneer vanished from her face, replaced by a look of surprised delight that would have seemed genuine to anyone who hadn't just witnessed what he had seen. "Darling," she exclaimed, moving toward him with open arms. "You're home early. What a wonderful surprise." But Alexander wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on his children, and what he saw there broke his heart into 1,000 pieces. Isabella was staring at him with a mixture of desperate hope and crushing fear, as if she couldn't quite believe he was really there, but was terrified that he might disappear again. Lucas was whimpering softly, his little body trembling against his sister's protective embrace. "What's going on here?" Alexander's voice came out as a hoarse whisper, barely controlled rage, making it difficult to form words. Vivian's laugh was like tinkling crystal, perfectly modulated and completely false. "Oh, you know how children can be, sweetheart. Isabella had a little tantrum, and I was just teaching her about appropriate behavior." The poor dear got herself all worked up over nothing. Alexander knelt down beside his children, his heart breaking as Isabella flinched away from his touch, before recognizing that his hands were gentle, not threatening. "Isabella, honey, are you okay? What happened to your dress?" The little girl looked from her father to her stepmother and back again, clearly terrified of saying the wrong thing. When she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I tried to get milk for Lucas from the kitchen. He was crying because he was hungry, and Mrs. Hartwell isn't here today, and I thought I could help." "And what did Vivian say when you tried to help?" Alexander kept his voice gentle, but his eyes never left his daughter's face, cataloging every bruise, every sign of distress. Isabella's lower lip trembled as she glanced fearfully at her stepmother. She said we're not allowed to eat unless she says we can, and she said if I told you anything, she would. The child's voice broke completely, and she buried her face against Lucas's soft hair. Alexander rose slowly to his feet, his entire body vibrating with a fury unlike anything he had ever experienced. When he looked at Vivian, she was still smiling that perfect, practiced smile. But there was something cold and calculating in her eyes that he had never noticed before. "Is this true?" he asked, his voice deadly quiet. Vivian moved closer to him, her hand reaching out to touch his arm in what was meant to be a comforting gesture. "Alexander, darling, you know how imaginative children can be. Isabella has been having some behavioral issues lately, and I've been trying to establish some structure and discipline while you've been working so hard. Sometimes that means setting boundaries about food and schedules." But as she spoke, Alexander's attention was caught by something else. A purple bruise on Isabella's wrist, partially hidden by the torn sleeve of her dress. He knelt down again and gently lifted his daughter's arm, revealing finger-shaped marks that could have only come from an adult's grip. The silence in the room was deafening as Alexander stared at the evidence of his wife's abuse. When he finally looked up at Vivian, any pretense of the loving stepmother had vanished from her face, replaced by a look of cold defiance. "How long?" he asked, his voice barely human. "How long, what?" She replied with false innocence. "How long have you been hurting my children?" Vivian's mask slipped completely then, revealing something ugly and twisted beneath the polished exterior. "Your children," she spat, "are spoiled brats who needed to learn some respect. Someone had to discipline them while their father was too busy running away from his responsibilities to care." Alexander stood up, his 6'2" frame towering over his wife. "Pack your things. You have 1 hour to get out of my house." Vivian laughed, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Your house? Need I remind you that we're married, Alexander? Community property laws in California are quite clear. This house is as much mine as it is yours. And those children, well, legally speaking, I have as much right to discipline them as you do." Vivian laughed, a harsh sound that had nothing to do with humor. "Your house? Need I remind you that we're married, Alexander? Community property laws in California are quite clear. This house is as much mine as it is yours. And those children, well, legally speaking, I have as much right to discipline them as you do." "We'll see about that," Alexander said coldly. He turned back to his children, his voice becoming gentle again. "Isabella, can you walk? I want to get you and Lucas somewhere safe." The little girl nodded bravely and struggled to her feet, still holding her baby brother protectively. Alexander carefully lifted Lucas from her arms, his heart breaking as he felt how light the baby was, how his tiny ribs showed through his clothing. When was the last time this child had been properly fed? As they walked toward the door, Vivian called after them with venom in her voice. "Go ahead and run, Alexander. But remember, I know all your secrets, all your weaknesses. You think you can just throw me away like yesterday's newspaper? You'll find out exactly how wrong you are." Alexander didn't turn around, didn't acknowledge her threats. Instead, he focused on getting his children to safety, his mind already working on the steps he would need to take to protect them permanently. As they left the living room behind, Isabella slipped her small hand into his free one and whispered words that would haunt him forever. "Daddy, I knew you'd come back for us. I told Lucas every night that you would come back." In that moment, Alexander Montgomery realized that his real life was just beginning. Alexander carried his children through the marble hallways of his Beverly Hills mansion, each step taking them further away from the nightmare they had been living and closer to a safety he was determined to provide. Isabella walked beside him with surprising strength for a 7-year-old who had endured months of psychological torture, her small hand gripping his jacket as if afraid he might disappear again. Lucas nestled against his father's chest, his crying finally beginning to subside as he felt the steady rhythm of a heartbeat he had barely known, but somehow recognized as home. But where could they go? Alexander's mind raced through possibilities as they reached the main foyer. The estate was Vivian's legal residence now, and California's community property laws meant she had every right to return. His own penthouse in downtown Los Angeles was too isolated, too far from the support systems his children would need. Then he remembered the guest house at the back of the property, the small Spanish-style cottage that Catherine had used as her art studio before her illness. Vivian rarely went there, claiming it was too rustic for her tastes, and it had a separate entrance that could be secured independently from the main house. "Where are we going, Daddy?" Isabella asked in a whisper, still glancing nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting her stepmother to appear at any moment. "Somewhere safe, sweetheart," Alexander replied, his voice steady, despite the turmoil raging in his chest. "Somewhere we can figure out what happens next." The walk to the guest house took them through Catherine's rose garden, where the afternoon sun cast long shadows between the carefully tended beds. Alexander remembered countless evenings when his late wife had worked among these flowers, her hands gentle with the pruning shears, her voice soft as she told Isabella stories about each variety they had planted together. Now the roses seemed to stand as silent witnesses to the betrayal that had taken place in their absence. The cottage door opened with the same key that unlocked the main house, and Alexander stepped inside with his children, immediately feeling the presence of happier memories. Catherine's easel still stood by the large window, an unfinished landscape of the vineyard visible in the late afternoon light. Her brushes sat exactly where she had left them, waiting patiently for hands that would never return to complete the work they had started. Alexander settled Lucas in the center of the bed, surrounding him with pillows to keep him safe, then turned his attention to Isabella. The little girl stood uncertainly in the middle of the room, her torn dress and tangled hair making her look far younger than her 7 years. Without a word, he went to the small bathroom and returned with a warm, damp washcloth. "Let me help you get cleaned up," he said gently, kneeling to her level. "Then we'll find some food for both of you." As he carefully washed the dirt and tear stains from his daughter's face, Alexander felt the full weight of his failure as a father settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. How long had Isabella been protecting her baby brother while he traveled the world, building a business empire that meant nothing if he couldn't protect the two people who mattered most? How many nights had she gone to bed hungry because her stepmother had decided they didn't deserve dinner? How many times had she whispered Lucas to sleep with promises that Daddy would come home soon? "Daddy," Isabella said softly, as he gently worked a tangle from her hair, "are you going to send us away?" The question hit Alexander like a physical blow. "Send you away? Isabella, honey, why would you think that?" Vivian said, "You don't really want us." She said, "That's why you're always traveling, because taking care of us is too hard and you wish we had never been born." The words came out in a rush, as if Isabella had been holding them inside for months and finally found the courage to voice her deepest fear. Alexander dropped the washcloth and pulled his daughter into his arms, holding her against his chest as his own tears began to fall. "Isabella, listen to me very carefully. You and Lucas are the most important things in my entire world. Everything I do, everything I work for, is for you too. I have never, not for one single second, wished you had never been born. You are the greatest gifts your mother ever gave me. Then, why did you leave us with her?" Isabella's voice was muffled against his shoulder, but the pain in her words was crystal clear. Alexander closed his eyes, struggling to find words that could explain adult grief and guilt to a child who had suffered because of his emotional cowardice. "Because I was scared, sweetheart. When Mummy died, I felt so sad and lost that I didn't know how to be a good daddy anymore. I thought if I worked very hard, I could make the sadness go away, and then I could come home and be the father you deserved. But I was wrong. I should never have left you, and I promise you, I will never make that mistake again." Isabella pulled back to look at his face, her blue eyes so much like Catherine's, searching his expression for truth. "Do you promise? Do you promise you won't leave us again?" "I promise," Alexander said firmly. "From now on, we're a team. You, me, and Lucas. And teams stick together, no matter what." For the first time since he had found them in the living room, Isabella smiled. It was a tentative, fragile smile, but it transformed her entire face and reminded Alexander so vividly of Catherine that his breath caught in his throat. "I've been taking care of Lucas," she said, with quiet pride. "When Vivian wouldn't feed him, I snuck into the kitchen at night and got formula from the cabinet. I know how to make bottles now." Alexander's heart broke and swelled with pride simultaneously. His 7-year-old daughter had been forced to become a mother to her infant brother, because the adults in their lives had failed them both. "You did such a good job taking care of him, Isabella. But you know what? From now on, that's my job. You get to go back to being a little girl who plays and learns and has fun, okay?" Isabella nodded, then climbed onto the bed next to Lucas, who was finally sleeping peacefully for the first time in months. Alexander watched his children for a moment, memorizing the sight of them safe and together, before he pulled out his phone and dialed the number of the one person he trusted completely. Jonathan Pierce answered on the first ring, his voice carrying the crisp professionalism that had made him one of Los Angeles's most respected family attorneys. "Alexander, I wasn't expecting to hear from you until next week's board meeting. Jonathan, I need your help. Not as a business advisor, but as someone who knew Catherine and cares about our family." Alexander stepped out onto the small patio so his conversation wouldn't wake the children. "Vivian has been abusing Isabella and Lucas. I caught her in the act today, and I need to know what legal options I have to protect them permanently." The silence on the other end of the line lasted several seconds before Jonathan responded, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Tell me everything. Don't leave out any details, no matter how small they might seem." Alexander recounted the scene in the living room, describing Isabella's torn dress, the bruises on her wrist, Lucas's obvious malnourishment, and Vivian's cold admission that she viewed the children as burdens rather than precious lives to be cherished. As he spoke, he could hear Jonathan taking notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and witnesses. "Alexander, this is serious criminal behavior we're talking about. Child endangerment, physical abuse, emotional trauma. Any one of these charges could result in significant jail time. But before we involve law enforcement, we need to secure emergency custody protection for Isabella and Lucas. Can you bring them to my office first thing tomorrow morning?" "Of course. Whatever it takes." "Good. In the meantime, I want you to document everything. Take photographs of Isabella's injuries. Write down every conversation you can remember. Gather any evidence that might support your case. And Alexander, don't let Vivian anywhere near those children. If she shows up at the cottage, call 911 immediately." After ending the call with Jonathan, Alexander sat in one of Catherine's wicker chairs and allowed himself a moment to process the magnitude of what had just happened. His marriage was over, his children had been traumatized, and the woman he had trusted with their care had revealed herself to be a monster hiding behind designer clothes and charity luncheon smiles. But underneath the horror and guilt, he felt something else growing. A fierce determination to rebuild his family and ensure that Isabella and Lucas would never again experience the fear and neglect they had endured. The sound of a car engine made him look up sharply. Through the grove of olive trees that separated the cottage from the main house, he could see Vivian's white Maserati pulling out of the circular driveway at high speed, gravel spraying behind her wheels. She was leaving, but Alexander doubted it was permanent. Vivian Ashford was not the type of woman who accepted defeat gracefully, and her parting words about knowing his secrets suggested she had no intention of walking away from the Montgomery fortune without a fight. 20 minutes later, another car pulled into the driveway, the practical Honda Civic that belonged to Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell. Alexander watched the elderly housekeeper emerge from her vehicle carrying grocery bags, her movements quick and efficient despite her 73 years. Eleanor had been with the Montgomery family for over 15 years, had helped Catherine through her illness, and had mourned her death as genuinely as any blood relative. If anyone could provide insight into what had been happening in his absence, it would be her. Alexander met Eleanor at the main house, taking the grocery bags from her arms as she looked around with obvious concern. "Mr. Montgomery, I wasn't expecting you home until Thursday. Where are Mrs. Montgomery and the children?" "That's what I need to talk to you about, Eleanor. Could you sit down for a moment?" The older woman's weathered face creased with worry as she took a seat at the kitchen island, where she had prepared thousands of meals for the Montgomery family. Alexander sat across from her, choosing his words carefully. Eleanor, I need you to tell me the truth about what's been happening here while I've been traveling. Have you noticed anything unusual about how Vivian treats Isabella and Lucas? Eleanor's hands clasped together tightly in her lap, and Alexander could see her internal struggle playing out across her features. Finally, she sighed deeply and looked him directly in the eye. Mr. Montgomery, I've been wanting to talk to you about this for months. But Mrs. Montgomery warned me that you were under tremendous stress with the company expansion and that I shouldn't burden you with household concerns. What kind of concerns? The children, sir. Mrs. Montgomery has very strict rules about when they're allowed to eat, when they can play, even when they can use the bathroom. She locks their bedroom doors at night from the outside, claiming it's for their own safety. But I've heard them crying in there and not being allowed out even for water. Eleanor's voice grew stronger as she continued, as if the relief of finally telling the truth was giving her courage. She dismisses me early most days, sir, usually right after lunch, but I've come back a few times to retrieve things I'd forgotten. I've seen her force Isabella to scrub floors with her bare hands, and I've watched her give Lucas bottles that were so watered down they were practically clear. Alexander's hands clenched into fists on the granite countertop. Why didn't you call me? I tried, sir, several times. But Mrs. Montgomery always answered your phone when you were traveling, and she assured me she would pass along my concerns. When nothing changed, I assumed you had decided to support her disciplinary methods. Eleanor paused, tears beginning to form in her kind eyes. I should have tried harder, Mr. Montgomery. Those poor babies have been suffering, and I let my fear of losing my job prevent me from protecting them properly. Eleanor, this is not your fault. Vivian manipulated all of us, and she deliberately isolated me from information that would have led me to discover her abuse. But I need to ask, would you be willing to testify about what you've seen? In court, if necessary? The housekeeper straightened her shoulders with the dignity of someone who had spent decades serving others with integrity. For those children, for Miss Catherine's babies, Mr. Montgomery, I would testify before God himself if it meant keeping them safe. As if summoned by their conversation, Alexander heard the sound of footsteps on the patio outside the kitchen. He looked through the French doors to see Isabella approaching the house, carrying Lucas in her thin arms with the practiced ease of someone far too young to have such responsibilities. Daddy, Isabella called softly. Lucas is hungry, and I didn't know if it was okay to use the kitchen in the cottage. Alexander rushed to open the door, immediately taking Lucas from his daughter's arms and ushering them both inside. Of course it's okay, sweetheart. But you don't have to carry him everywhere. I'm here now, remember. Eleanor's face crumpled with emotion as she took in the sight of the children. Isabella's torn dress had been partially mended with safety pins Alexander had found in Catherine's sewing basket. But the bruises on her arms were clearly visible, and her golden hair still showed signs of neglect despite his attempts to comb it. Lucas was far too thin for a 10-month-old, his cheeks hollow, and his eyes too large for his small face. Oh, my sweet angels, Eleanor whispered, moving quickly to gather Isabella in a gentle hug. I'm so sorry. I'm so very sorry. Mrs. Hartwell, Isabella exclaimed, her face lighting up with genuine joy for the first time all day. You came back. Vivian said you weren't coming back anymore. Wild horses couldn't keep me away from you children, Eleanor replied firmly, then looked meaningfully at Alexander. I believe my employment situation may have been misrepresented to certain parties. Alexander nodded grimly. Another layer of Vivian's deception revealed. How many other lies had she told to maintain her facade of perfect stepmother while systematically tormenting his children? Mrs. Hartwell, Isabella continued, tugging on the housekeeper's apron, can you make Lucas some real formula? The kind that's thick and white? Vivian always made it so thin it was like water, and he cried all the time because his tummy hurt. Of course, darling. And then we'll make you both some proper dinner. What would you like? Grilled cheese sandwiches like your mama used to make. Or maybe some of that tomato soup you used to love. As Eleanor began preparing food with the efficient movements of long practice, Alexander found himself studying his children with new eyes. Isabella hovered close to Lucas constantly, checking his breathing, adjusting his position. whispering reassurances in his ear. She had developed the hypervigilant behavior of someone who had learned that safety could disappear without warning, that the adults who were supposed to protect her could become threats instead. Lucas, meanwhile, seemed to be coming alive for the first time since Alexander had found them. The baby was making soft cooing sounds, reaching toward the warm kitchen lights, even attempting what looked like a smile when Eleanor spoke to him in gentle tones. How much of his development had been stunted by months of inadequate nutrition and emotional neglect? The ringing of Alexander's phone interrupted his observations. The caller ID showed Jonathan Pierce's number, and Alexander stepped out onto the patio to take the call privately. "I've been making some preliminary inquiries," Jonathan said without preamble, "and I think we may have stumbled onto something much bigger than simple child abuse. Alexander, have you reviewed your financial accounts lately? Specifically, the trust funds you established for Isabella and Lucas?" Alexander felt a chill run down his spine. "No, I haven't looked at those in months. The quarterly statements go directly to my accountant." "Why?" "Because I just spoke with a contact at your bank, and there have been some very large withdrawals from those accounts over the past 6 months. Withdrawals that required dual authorization, yours and your wife's." "That's impossible. I never authorized any withdrawals from the children's trusts." "That's what I was afraid you'd say." "Alexander, I think we're looking at embezzlement on top of child abuse. Someone has been forging your signature or otherwise fraudulently accessing those accounts. Can you meet me at the bank first thing tomorrow morning? Before we go to court for the custody hearing?" Alexander closed his eyes, feeling the weight of betrayal settling even deeper into his chest. Vivian hadn't just been tormenting his children for sadistic pleasure, she had been systematically stealing their inheritance. While making their lives miserable, the trust funds contained over $10 million each. Money that Catherine had insisted be set aside to ensure their children's futures would be secure no matter what happened to their parents. "I'll be there," he said grimly. "And Jonathan Doe, I want her prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Not just for what she did to Isabella and Lucas, but for everything. Every crime, every lie, every penny she stole from my children's future. Consider it done." "But Alexander, be prepared for this to get ugly. If Vivian has been planning this for months, she probably has contingency plans. People like her don't steal millions of dollars without thinking through how they'll protect themselves when they get caught." After ending the call, Alexander stood for a long moment, looking out over Catherine's rose garden, where the last rays of sunlight were painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. Tomorrow would bring court hearings and bank meetings and the complicated process of legally removing Vivian from their lives forever. There would be police reports and testimony, and probably media attention that would turn their private nightmare into public spectacle. But tonight, his children were safe. Tonight, they were eating real food, prepared by someone who loved them. Sleeping in clean beds without locks on the outside of their doors, and falling asleep to the sound of their father's voice, reading stories instead of threats and cruelty. When Alexander returned to the kitchen, he found Isabella helping Eleanor wash dishes while Lucas sat in his high chair contentedly gnawing on a piece of soft bread. The sight of such ordinary domestic happiness after the horrors of the afternoon brought tears to his eyes once again. "Daddy, are you sad?" Isabella asked, noticing his expression. "No, sweetheart," Alexander replied, lifting her into his arms and breathing in the sweet scent of her freshly washed hair. "I'm not sad anymore, I'm grateful." "Grateful for what?" "For you, for Lucas, for the chance to be your daddy again." Isabella hugged his neck tightly, her small voice barely audible against his ear. "I'm grateful too, Daddy. I'm grateful you came home." As the evening settled around them like a protective blanket, Alexander Montgomery began to understand that his real fortune had never been measured in dollars or scientific achievements or business empires. His real wealth was sitting at his kitchen table, laughing at Eleanor's silly faces and reaching chubby hands toward the chandelier lights. And this time, he would never let anyone threaten that treasure again. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble steps of Los Angeles Superior Court as Alexander Montgomery walked through the heavy glass doors. His children's future hanging in the balance, Isabella held his hand tightly, her small fingers trembling despite the brave face she was trying to maintain for her baby brother's sake. Lucas rested peacefully in his father's arms, blissfully unaware that the next few hours would determine whether his family would remain together or be torn apart by legal technicalities and a woman's greed. Jonathan Pierce met them in the hallway outside courtroom 12, his usually immaculate appearance showing signs of a sleepless night spent preparing their case. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, but his expression carried the grim determination of a man who had seen too much injustice to let it happen again on his watch. "The bank meeting this morning confirmed our worst fears," Jonathan said quietly, keeping his voice low so Isabella wouldn't overhear the details. "Vivian has withdrawn over $6 million from the children's trust funds using forged documents. The signatures are good enough to have fooled the bank initially, but forensic analysis proves they're fake. She's been planning this systematic theft for months." Alexander felt his jaw clench with rage that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. $6 million, money that Catherine had insisted they set aside to ensure Isabella and Lucas would never want for anything. Money that was meant to pay for their education, their dreams, their security. Vivian had stolen not just cash, but pieces of his children's futures, and she had done it while simultaneously torturing them in their own home. "Where is she now?" Alexander asked. "That's the concerning part. She hasn't been seen since yesterday afternoon when she left the estate. Her attorney, Marcus Thornfield, claims she's preparing her defense. But I suspect she's either destroying evidence or planning to flee the jurisdiction entirely." The courtroom doors opened, and families began filing in for the morning session. Alexander recognized several faces from Beverly Hills social circles, neighbors and acquaintances who had always seen Vivian as the perfect society wife, gracious and charming at charity events and children's birthday parties. Today, they would discover the monster that had been hiding behind designer gowns and practiced smiles. Judge Patricia Blackwood entered the courtroom with the dignified bearing of someone who had spent 30 years separating truth from deception. Her silver hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark eyes missed nothing as they swept across the assembled parties. She had built her reputation on protecting children from adults who saw them as property rather than precious lives to be cherished and guided. "Your Honor," Jonathan began, as he rose to present their case. "We are seeking emergency custody protection for Isabella and Lucas Montgomery, ages 7 and 10 months respectively, on the grounds of systematic abuse, neglect, and financial exploitation by their stepmother, Vivian Ashford Montgomery." The evidence was overwhelming. Photographs of Isabella's bruises, medical records showing Lucas's malnourishment, Mrs. Hartwell's detailed testimony about locked bedroom doors and watered-down formula, bank statements proving millions of dollars in fraudulent withdrawals. Each piece of documentation painted a picture of calculated cruelty that made several observers in the gallery gasp with horror. But Vivian's attorney, Marcus Thornfield, was not finished fighting. A man in his 60s with silver hair and expensive suits. He had built his career defending wealthy clients who believed money could solve any legal problem. "Your Honor, my client maintains that she was providing necessary discipline to children who had become unmanageable following their mother's death. The allegations of abuse are greatly exaggerated, and the financial transactions were authorized by Mr. Montgomery himself during periods of extreme emotional distress." "Then where is your client, Mr. Thornfield?" Judge Blackwood's voice carried the sharp edge of someone who had heard too many excuses for inexcusable behavior. "She is preparing additional documentation to support her case, Your Honor. Or she is liquidating stolen assets and preparing to flee the country," Jonathan interjected. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Mrs. Montgomery has been transferring money to offshore accounts and has already purchased a one-way ticket to a non-extradition country under an assumed name." The courtroom erupted in whispers as this new information sank in. Alexander felt Isabella's hand tighten in his as she sensed the tension around them. Even if she didn't fully understand the legal proceedings that would determine her fate, Judge Blackwood studied the evidence for several long minutes, occasionally asking clarifying questions about timelines and witness testimony. Finally, she set the papers down and looked directly at Isabella, who was sitting quietly beside her father with the patient dignity of a child who had learned to be invisible to survive. "Isabella, would you like to tell me how you've been feeling at home?" The little girl looked up at her father, who nodded encouragingly, then stood and walked to the witness stand with steps that seemed too heavy for someone so young. When she spoke, her voice was clear and steady despite the magnitude of what she was revealing. "Your Honor, I've been scared every day since Daddy got married again. Vivian told me and Lucas that we weren't really part of the family anymore. That we were just burdens she had to deal with until we were old enough to be sent away. She locked our bedroom doors from the outside at night. And sometimes she forgot to let us out in the morning, so we couldn't use the bathroom or get water when we were thirsty." The silence in the courtroom was absolute as Isabella continued her testimony, describing months of psychological torture with the matter-of-fact tone of someone who had learned to accept cruelty as normal. "She made me clean the floors with my hands until they bled, and when Lucas cried because he was hungry, she said it was my job to keep him quiet or she would hurt him worse." Alexander felt tears streaming down his face as his daughter spoke, each word a knife blade twisting in his chest. How had he failed to see what was happening? How had he allowed his own grief to blind him to his children's suffering? "And what did you do when your stepmother threatened you?" Judge Blackwood asked gently. "I took care of Lucas the best I could. I snuck food from the kitchen when she wasn't looking, and I held him when he cried so she wouldn't get angry. I told him stories about Mummy and promised him that Daddy would come home someday and make everything better." Isabella's voice finally broke on these last words, and Alexander had to grip the arms of his chair to keep from rushing to comfort her. Judge Blackwood's expression had grown progressively grimmer throughout Isabella's testimony, and when the little girl finished speaking, the judge sat in silence for several moments, clearly struggling to maintain her professional composure in the face of such heartbreaking evidence. "Mr. Thornfield, does your client have anything to say in response to these allegations?" The defense attorney shuffled his papers nervously, clearly aware that his case was crumbling around him. "Your Honor, my client is not available for comment at this time." "Then let me make my ruling very clear," Judge Blackwood said, her voice ringing with authority. "Based on the overwhelming evidence of physical and emotional abuse, financial exploitation, and the defendant's apparent flight from this jurisdiction, I hereby grant full emergency custody of Isabella and Lucas Montgomery to their father, Alexander Montgomery. Furthermore, I am issuing immediate arrest warrants for Vivian Ashford Montgomery on charges of child endangerment, fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to commit theft." The gavel fell with a sound like thunder, and Alexander finally allowed himself to breathe. His children were safe. They were legally, officially, permanently safe from the woman who had terrorized them while wearing the mask of a loving stepmother. But even as relief flooded through him, Alexander knew this was only the beginning. Vivian was still out there somewhere, probably with millions of dollars in stolen money and nothing left to lose. A desperate woman with resources and connections could be dangerous in ways that went far beyond legal proceedings. As they left the courthouse, Isabella slipped her hand into his and looked up with eyes that seemed far too old for her 7 years. "Daddy, is it really over? Are we really safe now?" Alexander knelt down to her level, taking both of her hands in his as he made a promise he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "Yes, sweetheart. We're safe now, and we're going to stay safe. No one will ever hurt you or Lucas again." For the first time in months, Isabella smiled without fear shadowing her eyes. And in that smile, Alexander saw the beginning of their journey back to becoming a real family again. 3 weeks after the custody hearing, Alexander Montgomery stood in the kitchen of his Beverly Hills estate, watching his children eat breakfast with the kind of peaceful contentment he hadn't experienced since Catherine's death. Isabella sat at the marble island, carefully cutting her pancakes into perfect squares while explaining to Lucas, who was babbling happily in his high chair, why syrup needed to be distributed evenly across each bite. The morning sunlight streaming through the French doors caught the golden highlights in her hair. And for a moment, Alexander could see Catherine so clearly in their daughter's animated gestures that his breath caught in his throat. But this time, the memory didn't bring crushing grief. Instead, it brought a warm sense of continuity. As if Catherine's love was still present in every laugh, every careful bite, every protective glance Isabella cast toward her baby brother. The healing process had begun, slowly but surely, like flowers growing back after a devastating frost. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell moved efficiently around the kitchen, humming softly as she prepared Lucas's morning bottle with the kind of genuine care that had been missing from this house for far too long. The elderly housekeeper had become more than an employee. In recent weeks, she was family. A grandmother figure who remembered every detail of the children's preferences and needs with the devotion of someone who had watched them grow from their very first days. "Daddy, can we go to the vineyard today?" Isabella asked, maple syrup creating a sticky smile around her mouth. "I want to show Lucas the grapes. Mrs. Hartwell said they're almost ready to pick." "That sounds perfect, sweetheart," Alexander replied, reaching over to wipe her chin with a napkin. "We could have a picnic lunch out there. Would you like that?" Isabella's face lit up with the kind of unburdened joy that had been absent for so many months. "Can we bring the blanket Mummy used to use? The one with the yellow flowers?" "Of course we can." As Alexander lifted Lucas from his high chair, he marveled at how much the baby had changed in just 3 weeks. Proper nutrition and consistent love had transformed him from a listless, underweight infant into a chubby, giggling child who reached for everything with curious hands and babbled constantly in the language only babies understand. His pediatrician had pronounced him completely healthy at his last checkup, with no lasting effects from the months of neglect he had endured. Isabella's recovery was more complex, as emotional wounds always are. She still occasionally woke from nightmares, still flinched slightly when doors closed too loudly, still asked repeatedly if Alexander was really going to stay home today. But every day brought small victories, a moment of carefree laughter, a request to invite a friend over for a playdate, a bedtime story that ended with peaceful sleep instead of fearful tears. The sound of the doorbell interrupted their morning routine, and Eleanor went to answer it while Alexander continued feeding Lucas pieces of soft fruit. When she returned, her expression was troubled. "Mr. Montgomery, there's a woman at the door asking to speak with you. She says she's from Child Protective Services, but she doesn't have proper identification, and something about her seems ... off." Alexander's blood ran cold. He handed Lucas to Eleanor and moved quickly toward the front door, his mind racing through possibilities. Had Vivian somehow managed to manipulate the system from wherever she was hiding? Had she found a way to challenge the custody ruling through false accusations? But when he looked through the security monitor, his worst fears were confirmed. Standing on his doorstep, wearing a cheap polyester suit and carrying a clipboard, was Vivian herself. She had cut her platinum hair short and dyed it brown, removed her expensive jewelry, and traded her designer clothes for bargain store alternatives. But he would recognize those cold blue eyes anywhere. "Call 911, Alexander told Eleanor quietly. "Tell them we have an intruder attempting to gain access through false pretenses. Use the panic button if necessary." He activated the intercom system without opening the door. "Vivian, I know it's you. Leave my property immediately or I'll have you arrested." Her laugh was harsh and bitter, nothing like the musical sound she had used to charm him during their courtship. "Oh, Alexander, always so dramatic. I just want to see my stepchildren one last time before I disappear from your lives forever. Surely you can't deny a mother that small comfort. You were never their mother. A mother protects her children. A mother feeds them when they're hungry and comforts them when they're scared. You tortured them while stealing their inheritance. You have no rights here." "Rights?" Vivian's mask of false sweetness slipped completely. "You want to talk about rights? I gave up everything for your family. I moved into that mausoleum of a house, surrounded by pictures of your precious dead wife, playing second fiddle to a ghost. I raised your brats while you traveled the world building your empire, and this is how you repay me." Alexander could see Isabella hovering in the hallway, her eyes wide with fear at the sound of her stepmother's voice. He gestured for Eleanor to take both children to the back of the house while he dealt with this confrontation. "You didn't raise them, Vivian? You abused them systematically while embezzling millions from their trust funds. The FBI has been tracking your offshore accounts, and they know about the forged documents. Turn yourself in now, and maybe the prosecutor will show some leniency." "Leniency?" Vivian's voice rose to a near shriek. "I don't need leniency from anyone. Do you know what your precious Catherine told me right before she died? She begged me to take care of her children because she knew you were too weak and self-absorbed to do it yourself. She was right, wasn't she? You abandoned them the moment things got difficult." The words hit Alexander like physical blows, but he forced himself to remain calm. Vivian was desperate now, cornered and dangerous. Exactly the situation Jonathan had warned him about. Catherine never would have asked you to hurt her children. Whatever she said to you, it wasn't permission to torture innocent kids. Torture. Vivian laughed again, the sound carrying a note of genuine madness. "I was teaching them strength, resilience, self-reliance. The real world isn't full of trust funds and housekeepers who clean up every mess. I was preparing them for reality. By starving them, by locking them in their rooms, by threatening to throw them out on the street, by showing them that nobody gets a free ride in this world, not even precious Montgomery children with their dead saint of a mother." Alexander could hear sirens in the distance, growing closer. The police response time in Beverly Hills was excellent, a fact he had never appreciated more than at this moment. "It's over, Vivian. You can't hurt them anymore." But Vivian wasn't finished. "You think this is over? You think because some judge signed a piece of paper, you've won? Alexander, you have no idea what real loss feels like. You had everything handed to you: family money, business connections, a wife who worshipped the ground you walked on. You never had to fight for anything in your entire privileged life." The sirens were getting louder, and Alexander could see flashing lights through the trees lining his driveway. "The police are here. Vivian, end this now, before you make it worse for yourself." Worse. She reached into her purse, and Alexander tensed, ready to throw himself behind cover if she produced a weapon. But instead, she pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I saved the best for last, Alexander. Do you want to know why Catherine really died?" Alexander's heart stopped. "What are you talking about?" "The experimental treatment she was taking in those final months. The one that was supposed to save her life, but somehow made her condition deteriorate faster. The one that just happened to be manufactured by your biggest competitor in the cancer research field." The police cars were pulling into the driveway now, their sirens cutting off as officers emerged with weapons drawn. But Alexander couldn't move, couldn't breathe, as Vivian continued her verbal assault. She was being poisoned. Alexander, slowly, carefully, systematically. The medication that was supposed to cure her cancer was actually accelerating it. And the person who arranged for that particular treatment to be prescribed was someone who stood to inherit everything if your wife died before the new will could be finalized. "You're lying," Alexander said, but his voice came out as a whisper. "Am I checked the envelope, Alexander? Medical records, correspondence with pharmaceutical companies, financial records showing payments to the prescribing physician. Your perfect Catherine didn't die of cancer, she was murdered. And the person who killed her is standing right here, holding the evidence that could destroy your entire family legacy." The police officers were shouting commands now, ordering Vivian to drop the envelope and place her hands behind her head. But she was beyond hearing them, lost in the twisted satisfaction of delivering what she believed to be the ultimate revenge. "You destroyed my life, Alexander Montgomery. You used me, discarded me, turned your children against me, and had me arrested like a common criminal. But I'll have the last laugh, because now you'll spend the rest of your life wondering if every kiss, every I love you, every tender moment with your precious Catherine was built on a lie." The envelope fluttered to the ground as the officers tackled Vivian, her screams of rage and accusation echoing off the Spanish colonial architecture of the estate. Alexander stood frozen, staring at the manila folder as if it contained a poisonous snake. rather than documents that could potentially rewrite everything he thought he knew about his wife's death. Detective Maria Santos, who had been working the embezzlement case, approached him carefully. "Mr. Montgomery, are you all right? Did she threaten you or the children?" Alexander forced himself to focus on the present moment, on the reality of his children's safety rather than the possible ghosts of the past. "She made some wild accusations, probably desperate attempts to deflect attention from her own crimes." Detective Santos nodded grimly. "That's usually how it goes with people facing serious jail time. They'll say anything to shift blame or create doubt. We'll need you to give a formal statement, but first, let's make sure she's secured and your family is safe." As Vivian was loaded into the back of a police car, still screaming about conspiracies and cover-ups, Alexander felt Isabella's small hand slip into his et. She had emerged from the back of the house, despite Eleanor's attempts to keep her sheltered from the confrontation. "Daddy, is she gone now? Really gone?" Alexander knelt down and gathered his daughter into his arms, breathing in the sweet scent of her shampoo and feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his chest. "Yes, sweetheart. She's gone, and she's never coming back. We're safe now." But even as he spoke the words of comfort, Alexander's eyes were drawn to the manila envelope lying abandoned on his driveway. Whatever secrets it contained, whatever truths or lies Vivian had compiled in her final attempt at revenge, would have to wait. Right now, his children needed him to be present, to be strong, to be the father he should have been all along. 2 years later, the Montgomery family had found their rhythm again. The guest house had been converted into a children's playroom, filled with art supplies, musical instruments, and books that Isabella read aloud to Lucas every evening before bed. The main house no longer felt like a museum to Catherine's memory, but rather a living home where her love continued through the laughter of her children and the careful attention of their father. Isabella, now 9 years old, had grown into a confident, articulate child who excelled in school and protected her younger brother with the fierce devotion of someone who understood how precious family could be. Lucas, approaching his 3rd birthday, was a chubby, curious toddler who followed his sister everywhere and called her Bibi in a voice that could melt the coldest heart. Alexander had restructured his entire life around his children's needs. He worked from home 3 days a week, traveled only when absolutely necessary, and never missed a school play, soccer game, or bedtime story. The Montgomery biotech empire continued to thrive under his leadership, but his true success was measured in goodnight kisses, homework help, and weekend adventures in the vineyard. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell had officially become their family manager, overseeing not just the household but also coordinating playdates, medical appointments, and the 1,000 small details that kept their lives running smoothly. She had moved into the housekeeper's quarters permanently, becoming the grandmother figure the children needed and the support system that allowed Alexander to be fully present as their father. The legal proceedings against Vivian had concluded with her conviction on multiple felony charges. She was serving a 15-year sentence in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for at least 7 years. The stolen money had been recovered and returned to the children's trust funds, where it remained untouched, earning interest for their future educations and dreams. The manila envelope had never been opened. After consultation with Jonathan Pierce and careful consideration of what was best for his family, Alexander had chosen to have it destroyed without examining its contents. Whatever Vivian's final accusations might have been, whatever doubts she had tried to plant about Catherine's death, could not change the fundamental truth. Catherine had been a loving wife and mother who had fought bravely against cancer and died surrounded by people who cherished her. On a warm September evening, as the vineyard grapes hung heavy and ready for harvest, Alexander sat on the patio watching his children play in Catherine's rose garden. Isabella was teaching Lucas the names of different flowers while he toddled between the beds with the unsteady enthusiasm of a child discovering the world. The setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, and the air carried the sweet scent of roses mixed with the promise of autumn. "Daddy, look," Isabella called out, pointing to a butterfly that had landed on Lucas's chubby hand. "He's not even scared." Alexander smiled. reaching for his phone to capture the moment before the butterfly flew away. These were the memories he wanted to preserve, not the darkness of the past, but the light of their present and the bright promise of their future. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Alexander gathered his children for their evening routine of bath time, story time, and the whispered "I love yous" that ended each day. Tomorrow would bring new adventures, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that love could indeed triumph over hatred. That healing was possible even after the deepest wounds. And that family wasn't just about blood relations, but about the choice to stand by each other through whatever storms might come. The Montgomery family had learned that sometimes the most precious victories aren't won in boardrooms or courtrooms, but in the quiet moments when a child falls asleep feeling safe and loved, when a father keeps his promise to be present, and when healing happens one day at a time through the simple radical act of choosing love over fear. And in that choice, Catherine's legacy lived on, not in trust funds or legal documents, but in the laughter of her children and the devotion of a father who had finally learned what truly mattered in life.